Hello, back to Energy 101. Today we're talking about oil energy sources, where the oil comes from. And remember that oil makes up 36% of our total energy demand comes from oil, the largest sector of any of the energy sources that we get our energy from. And so that's weighted for it to be the last of our fossil fuels because it is the largest and it's got the most complexity because of the imports that we rely on for oil. And where does that oil go to? What's it used for? Well, 72% of the oil that we use in the U.S. goes to transportation. Cars, trucks, airplanes, ships, trains, etc. And the next category is much lower. Manufacturing is 23%, and much of that manufacturing oil is used for the molecule, that we call it, and not to make materials like plastics, rather than burning it for the energy to get out of it. So it's the molecule is most of the time more valuable than the energy that you get off of it by burning the molecule. So, but manufacturing has 23% of it, the consumption, and then residential is about 3%. That's primarily up in the Northeast. Homes and buildings that do not have natural gas pipelines running down the street in front of them, so they have no access to natural gas, because natural gas is 3 to 5 times cheaper than oil. They would cut their heating bills significantly, and but they don't have that option because of the lack of pipelines. Commercial buildings in the same category as residential for the same reason. They don't have access to natural gas. And they can make it propane. Both the residential and commercial people that are burning oil could convert to propane for an expense of changing the boiler burners over and their tanks. But propane is close to the same price as oil, so it's expensive, much more expensive. Then electricity is less than 0.5%. The electricity is the big one there because note that we don't get any significant electricity from oil. So one takeaway here, just make a point of it, we'll get to it more emphasis later. But when we talk about nuclear, solar, and wind, we're talking about sources that generate electricity. Those will not replace, and no matter how many we put in, do not replace oil, because we essentially don't use any oil, very insignificant, for electricity. So nuclear, solar, and wind power, even though you see ads on the television, you see in the media talking about we need to do those things, put in more nuclear, put in more solar, put in more winds in order to reduce our oil imports, it's just not true when you look at the data. Oil really came into its own in the early 1900s with spindletop. It is first discovered and used in automobiles from the mid-1800s to late 1800s. But the demand was not significant. Automobiles took off in the early 1900s, and they started trying to find more sources for oil. So oil production in the form that we currently know it really got started in Spindletop, Texas. And this is an actual photo taken in 1901 when they drilled the well, and the pressure down in the well was high and just shot the oil up. And of course they knew they had lots of money in their pocket when they saw that, because even back then that was a major wealth producer. Along with showing them parallel to how carbon, coal, and natural gas, CH4, is burned, the chemical formula. Here it's a little more complex and you don't have to memorize it or anything, but the general formula for oil is CN, where N can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. H, and the number of molecules of H is 2N plus 2. So again, N is the same throughout. and you have to have two NO2 molecules with that fuel molecule, hydrocarbon, and then the carbon gets again combined and reacted with carbon. Carbon and oxygen react to form CO2, which is a global warming gas, and water, N+1 molecules of water. In the process, the energy value of the molecules over here on the right are is lower than the energy contained in the molecules on the left. So since the energy, the chemical energy in these molecules is higher than the chemical energy in the molecules to the right, then it released energy, and that energy comes off as heat. And so where do we use this oil? How much do we use, and how much has been the trend? Well, this is an interesting chart. It's got a lot of interesting ups and downs to it. But if we start off over here all the way in the left at 1900s, which 1900 where oil really took off with the automobile industry, and then it built up, and you notice it was a pretty steady build up until in the 70s, and lots of things happened in the 70s. And one is that in the early 70s you had the oil embargo from OPEC, and they would not sell us any oil because they didn't like our foreign policy regarding Israel, and OPEC as a group refused to ship us any oil, and that had major impacts on us immediately, and lots of things happened. I'll give you one example. Filling stations could only open 8 to 5 on Monday through Friday, and they could not be open on weekends, so you could not take a weekend trip that used over 1 gallon on a round trip, or 1 tank of gasoline on one trip. And prices started going up dramatically, and prices during the 70s went from about $2 a barrel to close to $10 a barrel. That's a 5-fold increase, which of course, I mean, we talk about oil going from $100 a barrel to maybe might go to 150, we say. Well, that's only a 50% increase, rather than a 5-fold, 500% increase. So that was one effect, and that high price meant that we had to do something, and lots of financial incentives to reduce our oil consumption, and we did it. One of the major things that we did is got power generation off of oil, and we got it back on coal and natural gas. That was one of the major things, because we were producing significant amount of electricity from oil back in when we got to the early 70s. And by getting rid of those oil-consuming power plants, we dramatically dropped our oil consumption. That was when also we put in the first car efficiency, car mileage standards. So all cars had to meet certain standards, efficiency standards, and automobiles back before they had the standards got 12 to 14 miles per gallon on the average. Today they're somewhere in the high 20s, more than double what the efficiency is. And of course, that's cut oil consumption below what it would be without those standards dramatically. And then it's worked its way back up some in the meantime as we've taken those. This drop here is due to the recession, and as we saw, when you reduce economic activity, you reduce energy consumption, and that cuts across the board, including oil. We've come out of the recession, and we see that it is starting to come up here, that right in here. Production is starting to come back up as our economy is improving. So that's our oil consumption. Our oil production is a little different ball game, and this keep our perspective here. Notice that up here at the top, it's about 15 million barrels per day. I didn't mention that. The units we're dealing with here are million barrels per day of oil use, crude oil use. And so we're at about 15. And So let's look and see how that compares to what we're producing. Well, this is a chart that you don't see very often, but one that's important to put things in perspective. You notice the first, this is 1900 over here on the left, just like the last slide to keep things in perspective. 2012, I don't update things until the end of the year, and you have to wait a few months before all the data gets in. So the data stops here at 2012, but it's kind of interesting, not kind of interesting, it is. Notice that the peak oil production in the U.S., and this is U.S. oil production, not world, just U.S. And the yellow shows how much we produced in the lower 48 states, and the purple shows how much was produced in Alaska, because it had a significant impact when we discovered the Alaska oil slope, oil on the Alaska slopes, north to sea. So, but notice we've never produced as much oil as we produced in the early 70s before we had the oil embargo. And we were producing about 9.5 million barrels per day. It dropped off then, and then Alaska came in, and notice that grew very rapidly as we developed that resource up there. We're doing that same thing in North Dakota in the oil shale fields right now. That won't last forever, but notice how we've used a significant amount of that up, and it declines. Oil production from existing wells, once you drill it and start producing from it, drops about 6% a year. So you got to run like heck in order to keep your same total oil production. You got to find 6% more oil production every year in order to keep producing the same amount that you have been producing. So it's a tough battle to keep. Notice we dropped down here to about 5 million barrels per day, and now we're up to about 6, a little above 6. So we are on the upslope with the oil shales that mainly due to the oil shale that we're getting, and with horizontal drilling and fracking and et cetera. So that chart, one of the more surprising things is how far below our oil production volumes we are from 1970 to when it was 9.5. We're now just cleared 6 recently. But we saw a similar, having been around a while and lived through all this, this trend I don't expect to last forever, just like this one didn't last forever. One thing I've learned in my old age is nothing lasts forever. The only thing we can be guaranteed is things will change. Another interesting thing is in 1970, when we produced more oil than any other time in our country's history, oil was $2 a barrel. $2 a barrel. So we had very little financial incentive, but we found all the easy oil. It's kind of like I use the example of you got basketballs and ping pong balls buried on the beach in the sand, and you go around with a pole trying to find where all the balls are, and the amount of oil that's in each ball is proportional to the size, of course, of the ball. Well, what are you going to find first? You're going to find the basketballs first, and they're easy to find because they're bigger. But the little reserves, the ping pong balls, are harder to find. So we're finding all the major basketballs, and some of the technology is improving, however, to help us find now the smaller ping pong balls, so to speak. So that's one analogy that might help understand why it is a finite resource. Oil, there's only so much oil in the ground. And with technology, we improve how much we can find and recover, but we have to keep working to try and finding more and more. So that's an interesting chart. Putting it together, since consumption is more than our production, this shows up here, it shows the consumption is up here, which was on the first slide, about 15 million barrels a day. And down here, we're at about 6 million barrels per day, 6 and 15. So that means that we're importing about 40, it turns out about 40 or 45% of our oil is being imported right now. because into this country. And this is one thing you have to be aware of. A lot higher percentage, I should note, is being imported today over here than it was back in the 70s when we had the oil embargo. So we're a lot more vulnerable than we were in the 1970s. And there's lots of ramifications to that. When we look at just the oil imports, so we can see it a little clearer, we're looking at only the red portion now, so we can see what our import trend has been. You see that it's dropped with our increased oil production that we've seen recently, from about 10 million barrels a day imports to about 8.5 million barrels a day imports. So we're down in the 50s, low 50s or so, mid 50s percent oil, the percent of our oil that we're getting by imports. So it is coming down. Again, it came down also in the 70s and early 80s, but that trend, as I said, most of them end at some point. Just a reminder that 72% of our oil is used for transportation, and that's the big dog on the block that we have to worry about. And if we can get better fuel mileage, which now they've got standards going up to 50 miles per gallon in 2025, will significantly reduce our oil consumption and help our oil import situation. So in conclusion, U.S. is dependent on imported oil. Approximately 55% of oil consumption is imported. I'm not going to debate whether it's 50 or 56 or 53 or the point is we're importing half or more of our oil. U.S. is energy independent, however, for coal and gas. Independent for coal and gas. 100% dependent on coal. Gas, if you look at North America, we're totally independent. We do import about 15% of our natural gas, but that's from Canada and Mexico, which politically we expect that to be fairly stable. And coal and gas is the electric power fuel source. So from electric power viewpoint, we are energy independent for the fuels that we use for electricity generation. Thank you.